Good morning and welcome to Gospel Baptist Church Adult Sunday School class. And in this lesson we have been studying Mark chapter 6, and we'll continue with our study of Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 35 of Mark chapter 6. And it reads, in Mark chapter 6, starting with verse 35, it reads, "And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, This is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that we may go into the country round about and into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. He answered and said to them, Give ye them to eat. And they said to him, Shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat? He said to them, How many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew, they say, 5 and 2 fishes. And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he looked up into heaven and blessed and brake the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to eat before them. And the 2 fishes divided he among them all. And they did all eat and were filled. And they took up the 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fishes. And they did eat of the loaves, and they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men." You know, in the previous lesson, Jesus had sent his disciples out to teach and bring the gospel anywhere they could go, in all the cities abroad. And the disciples did, and they came back and they were tired, and Jesus was tired. He says, well, let's go off into a desert place, which is really a place set aside away from town so they could rest. And so the disciples were all excited, thinking, we're tired, we're going to finally get to rest and just talk with Jesus. And as they were leaving, guess what happened? Thousands of people began to show up. And the disciples told Jesus, he's like, well, just send them away. We're tired. But Jesus looked at the people and had compassion. And he said, well, they're like a shepherd they're like a sheep lost without their shepherd. And he said, so he sat down and began to teach. So now he's been teaching for hours. I'm sure his disciples are like looking at that. They had watches. They'd be looking at their watches. Like, when is this day going to end? And I understand how they feel. I've been this way with my grandfather. My grandpa said, at 5 o'clock we're going to stop and we're going to rest for the day. And then it'd be 4:30. Chad and I are looking at our watches, and we see all this stuff that he still has to do. And at 4:55, we still have stuff to do. There it's 5 o'clock, and Grandpa goes, well, you know what? I think we got to work till 6 to get this done. Because Grandpa, when he set a goal in mind, he did not stop until that goal was met, irrespective. And I'm like, well, you've been going since 6 a.m. And it was 6, and here comes 6 o'clock, and there's still other boxes to go through. And so he wouldn't stop till every single box he got at a garage sale was gone through. Everything was clean. The junk was thrown away. What he could sell was packed and put wherever he needed to put it until he go to Mexico to sell it. And we wouldn't stop till the work was done. And Jesus' purpose is that just because the day is spent doesn't mean necessarily the work is done. And he saw that these people needed help, and he was going to help them. So here we are, we have the disciples now. It's like, all right, Jesus, it's time to stop. These people are hungry. They're looking like they're about to devour us. You need to send them away. He says, no, just feed them. They're like, well, how can you feed them? We don't have any money. Do we have to spend all this money? Not even 200 penny worth is going to be enough to buy these people enough food. He says, well, hey, what food do we have? Let's focus on what we have. The lesson writers write, the disciples' solution was to get rid of the need by getting rid of the needy. Jesus saw a different solution and wanted the disciples to see it also. You give them something to eat. It's hard to know if the disciples were angry or just couldn't believe what Jesus said. Clearly they thought spending about a year's income, that's 200 penny worth, to feed this multitude for one meal was not only impossible, but also a waste. Think of all this money spent for one meal. You know, when Mom and I go out to eat, a lot of times we look at restaurants and things we can get that are more than one meal. You know, because instead of spending a lot of money for just something you're going to eat today, just eat for one meal, we want something we can eat multiple times. Because it's always, but here it is, that you're going to buy just enough food just for one meal. That's a lot of money that we don't have. You know, we always tend to limit God with our minds. We limit God. When we say, well, what is impossible with us is not impossible with God. Understandably, it never entered into their minds that Jesus might provide for the multitude a miracle. Even though they saw many miracles, they saw him raise the dead, they saw him heal the blind, they saw him heal the sick, they saw him forgive sins, they saw him cast out devils, and yet they never imagined that Jesus could also do a miracle in regards to food. A shadow would love this. He would like me to make unlimited greenies for him. Just go into that bag and another greenie. That happened last week. He had, I could have swore he had one more greenie left, and then that was it. Then I have to wait till payday. And I reached in the bag, and there were 2 greenies still there. So he had 2 days worth. He had a greenie that day and then a greenie the next, which the next day was Thursday, so it was only 1 day he was without greenies. You can't have a dog without greenies. They get very upset. God has resources that we know nothing about. So we can trust him and be at peace when we can't figure out how he will provide. Jesus' suggestion might have seemed so extravagant to the disciples. Jesus, if we had that kind of money, we would never spend it on one meal for a crowd. They annoy us. They would be hungry again in a few hours. Should the money be spent on something else? But Jesus performed an extravagant miracle because he wanted to sit down to dinner with the multitude because he loved them. God's way of provision always begins with what we already have. He wants us to use what we already have wisely. Don't foolishly pray for more from God if you don't use what you already have, what is given to you in a godly way. It's like a person who cannot spend their money wisely praying to be a millionaire. You know, and that's, you know, and we've seen that. There was a rapper who became wealthy at a very young age, and he wisely, his parents taught him to invest the money and to use it wisely instead of going out and buying a fancy car, buying jewelry, buying a big mansion. He stayed in a small apartment and lived, no one would ever know he was very, very wealthy. And over time, he gained more wealth. And somebody sat down and talked to him and said, why are you still wealthy when so many singers, so many artists aren't? He said, because I use what I have wisely. He says, my parents taught me growing up that with little money you make do. With larger, when you get more money, you make do. He says, don't overspend. And he said, because of that, I never was in debt. And as the more money I made, I realized that if I want to stay wealthy, that I invest. And he says now he can afford a mansion and be able to sustain it. He can afford all this, and he of course, he has record labels under him. He does lots of other stuff, but because he used it wisely. You know, God's not going to make you a millionaire if you're not good with a few dollars. God's not going to give you more. If you can't win one soul, you can't ask God to help you win 1,000 souls. You know, that's the thing. God uses what you have, and he wants to see if you can be trusted with what you have. He wants us to use what we already have wisely. Don't fool me. That's where I read that part. What they did have was almost laughable. 5 loaves and 2 fishes was about enough for 1 or 2 people, because they were small loaves and small fishes. This wasn't tuna. It wasn't a baguette like you see in I've seen something like French bakeries that are like 4 feet long, and you have tuna fish. No, these were small loaves of bread and small fishes. Even though the amount was tiny, Jesus still started with what they had. Jesus told the multitude to sit down because these people were like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus acted like their shepherd. The good shepherd makes me lie down in green pastures, as is written in Psalms 23, verse 2. Jesus organized the multitude. He didn't want a mob scene. He wanted to have a nice dinner with these people. God likes organization, especially when it comes to managing what he provides for us. The ancient Greek word for groups is a very particular word. It is the normal Greek word for rows of vegetables in a vegetable garden. When you looked at the little groups as they sat in their orderly rows, they looked for all the world like rows of vegetables in a series of a garden plots. You know, when Grandpa, and of course all of you that garden know, that you don't just haphazardly plant things. That like Grandpa, the gardens, everything was in a row. Everything was in their place. So you can imagine, you had the big, heavy-set people grouped together here. The smaller people grouped here. Everybody grouped in an orderly fashion so they could easily be able to get what was needed. You know, versus chaos, you know, when you see, you know, if you ever watched a video where food is being delivered or water is being delivered to a place that's had, you know, like in a third world country where people are starving, you see them launch forward and they're grabbing as fast as they can, ripping things out. You have people being hit and punched, people getting into fights. It's not orderly. But what Jesus did is, look, you're hungry, I know, just stay calm, everybody be taken care of, sit down, let's get grouped together, and he made sure everything was orderly. When Jesus blessed before the meal, he didn't bless the food, he blessed God for supplying it. The idea of praying before a meal isn't to bless the food, it is to bless God in the sense of thanking and honoring him for blessing us with the food. Jesus faithfully followed the accepted form. He took the bread in his hands, pronounced the blessing, broke the bread into pieces, and distributed it. The only deviation from normal practice was while praying, Jesus looked full toward heaven rather than downward as prescribed. Jesus miraculously multiplied the loaves and fishes until far more than 5,000 were fed. Seemingly the miracle happened in the hands of Jesus. It really seems too extravagant. Why feed multitude until they were filled and eat any more? Why not just give them a little meal? Wouldn't that be enough? No. Jesus had people he loved out over for dinner, and there will always be more than enough food. That's how much Jesus loved them and loves us. It's always more than sufficient. You know, David said, you know, Lord, ask the Lord to pour, water into his cup. And he said, second says, Lord, my cup runneth over. God always over provides. You know, this is kind of a funny story. It wasn't funny at the time, but my aunt, several years ago, my mom's cousin Mike, his wife Pam, passed away. And we went to her church. In her church, the people provided, of course, like most churches, they provide the lunch, the meal for the people, for the grieving families. And it was more than you could ever imagine. They had every dessert you could imagine. They had so much things, so many different wonderful things to eat. Some bought fried chicken from KFC. A lot of the women made their own stuff. You know, some had sandwiches. It was like more than sufficient. We were all full. Now, my Aunt Jeannie's church, she was the one who provided everything. She loved to cook, and they could always count on her. However, she passed away. So here we are, and it was like a few sandwiches. Some of them didn't even make the sandwich. You had the bread and the meat and the slices of cheese. You had some brought one little thing of Oreo cookies. It was as bare minimum as you could get. And people looked at that, and I think most of us didn't touch anything. It was like there wasn't enough. There really wasn't. So we all we're just going to go eat afterwards. We'll eat somewhere else. That was stingy. So stingy. Not hardly anybody provided. And so Jesus isn't like that. When he provides, it isn't just a taste. It is the whole supper, if you will. Jesus provided extravagantly, yet simply. As long as he was making food miraculously, he could have provided steak and lobster and any number of other great things, but he simply gave people bread and fish. When Jesus provides, don't be surprised if he provides simply. If someone left hungry, it is either because they refused the bread from Jesus or because the apostles didn't distribute the bread to everyone. Jesus supplied plenty for everybody to eat a good meal, but everybody had to eat for himself. Sometimes we attend a spiritual meal, we gather food for everyone else except ourselves. What a beautiful, I said, man, that's almost a sermon in itself. And you think about it, and this is true, anybody went home hungry, it's because they didn't want it. You know, that's like salvation, truth. It's presented, the whole full course is presented, but what you get out of it is what you want to get out of it. And that's the hardest thing. My grandfather, God would lay somebody on his heart, and God would prepare him a message, and Grandpa would work hours. Thankfully, I got a new sermon. I did not have to get up at 3 in the morning. I was so happy because, every night I'd work on it. And sometimes, especially Friday night, I was like, you know what? I'm going to be off most of the day Saturday. I don't need to study. I'm like, I started working on it and I finished it. I'm like, well, thank you, Lord, for finishing. It took about an hour, but I got it done. And I was so happy because, of course, I didn't realize that I was going to have such a horrible migraine all day Saturday that I really couldn't see anything to study. But God had me finish it the day before. I didn't have to get up at 3 in the morning because it was done. But Grandpa worked so hard, and he provided the feast. And then there were people that wouldn't eat. That one person that God laid on his heart sat there the entire time with their arms folded, looked like an angry bullfrog, just croaking. The little chin going out. And he would preach and he almost would go down and stand right in front of them. He was getting so irritated that they weren't moving. And then the invitation will come forward, they wouldn't move, and they'd walk out the same way they walk in. And Grandpa, after it was over, he'd come in, he'd throw his coat off, and he'd sit down on the couch in Grandma's front room, and he said, I quit. He says that person didn't move an inch. I preached this sermon could have helped them, and they just didn't take it. But Grandma would say, she goes, but you did what God asked. You provided the meal. It's their fault for refusing to eat. Just like Shadow, we provide him the tater tots, the French fries. If he refuses to eat them, he was stubborn this morning. He sat down and he was mad because he expected us to get something different than what he wanted. And Mom had egg, and she gave him some tater tots. He got up and went to the bathroom, sat down in the door, had his back to us, and then he turned around and looked reproachfully at us. And Mom goes, well, if your attitude doesn't change, dog, you're not going to get another bite from me. Of course, as soon as she pulled out the egg, he got up, wagged his tail, came over, and laid his head on her lap. What he got was he was stubborn. He was mad. I guess he expected me to go to McDonald's. I went to Brahms instead of McDonald's because he likes me when I go to McDonald's because Mom will have egg and she'll eat a bite and give him a bite. Then I have a biscuit I share. I didn't do that, so he was mad at me. I'm like, dog, you're the dog. You get, if you don't eat it, it's your fault. We gave it to you. But that's the truth. People, all you can do is give. You provide. If they refuse, that's not your fault. That's theirs. The assurance that Jesus can provide, even miraculously, for all our needs should be precious to us. It was to the earliest Christians. On the walls of the catacombs and other places of early Christian art, loaves and fishes were common pictures. Jesus could have just left all of the food behind, but he didn't. Jesus generally provides, but he doesn't want things wasted. It isn't because Jesus is cheap or doesn't trust for future provision. He simply knew that wastefulness didn't glorify the God of all provision.
Amen.
Moving on, you know, this really, if you think about this, this does harken back to the Exodus when God provided the manna. And it was sufficient for the day. And people would try to hoard it, and then it would rot and stink. And, you know, because it was provided for the specific provision. He don't want waste. God doesn't like us to waste our time in our lives. He wants us to keep busy, which also will be touched on in my lesson, my message today later. Now moving on to verse 45. And straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while he sent away the people. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. Jesus loved the multitude, but he was not obsessed with the crowds. He knew when to kindly tell them to go home. He sent the multitude away. A long, difficult day spent ministering to the spiritual and physical needs of the multitude left Jesus exhausted. But that hard day drove Jesus to prayer, not from prayer. You know, the truth is, a couple of things we learn here, is that there is a time when you have to stop. When Grandpa was dealing with people, if that person, if their heart was too hard, there's no point in saying anything else. You know, Paul told Timothy, don't argue with people. Let me tell you something. I love to argue. But I realize there's a time where I've said what is needed, and if they don't take it, it's just like with a customer. I have a customer that's angry because their bill was too high, but they're not paying the entire bill. They're only paying parts of it, and now they're getting further and further past due. That's not the cell phone company's fault. They need to either let their kids pay part of the bill and get things caught up, versus them trying to take the entire load. That's not a cell phone carrier problem. That's a person problem. I could only talk to them so much. If they utterly refuse to listen, then that call is over with. Because I've done what I was told them, I set the expectations, now it's up to them to deal with the resolution. And that's the same thing with Jesus. Jesus knew the time was done, that the people have been taught, they have been fed. They might want more and more and more, but Jesus gave them all that they needed for the day. It's time for them to go. The same thing with the sermon. You know, there are people that the sermon ended like an hour ago, and they're still going. You know, that's too much. Jesus knows that he can't just keep going and going. Not only does it tire himself out more, but it wears out the people. So he knew when to stop. Grandpa knew when to stop. And Grandpa taught me when to stop. Get up, say what you say, get down, don't linger. Because we Baptists, we get hungry. And sooner or later, they're going to get mobbed and they're going to drag you out because you're going too long. Now moving on to verse 47. And when the even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea and alone on the land. And he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary to them. And about the fourth watch of the night he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. When they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out. For they saw him, and was troubled. And immediately he talked with them, and said to them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. Jesus sent the disciples across the Sea of Galilee. As he prayed in the heights above the Sea of Galilee, he saw them straining and rowing as they attempted to cross the lake in the face of the wind. Unknown to the disciples, Jesus saw their difficulty and cared for them. It was difficult to get across because a great wind was blowing. They had rowed for much of the night and only come about halfway across the lake. Now, anybody who's ever been to the Great Lakes know that it ain't like Overhoser. I guarantee you, no matter how heavy the wind blows at Overhoser, you're going to cross that lake because it's small. It's tiny. The Great Lakes, though, are like an ocean unto themselves. They're talking about all the shipwrecks that went down in those Great Lakes. So imagine you have this huge lake, and the wind is blowing, waves are beating past. For every few feet they row, they get pushed back further back. And so they're struggling. So Jesus sees them, and he cares. Spurgeon would write, the apostolic crew rowed and rowed and rowed, and it was no fault of theirs that they made no progress, for the wind was contrary to them. The Christian man may make little or no headway, and yet it be no fault of theirs, for the wind is contrary. Our good Lord will take the will for the deed, and reckon our progress, not by our apparent advance, but by the hearty intent with which we tug at the oars. Oh, what a beautiful saying. You know, I know Grandpa would feel discouraged many times when nobody would come forward. Because used to this, this church was full of people. He'd have new people coming in all the time, because every garage sale you went to, he'd witness, and people would be looking for a small church, and they'd come by the crowds. But he would preach and preach and preach, and yet no person would move forward. God was never disappointed in him because people didn't move. He did what he was supposed to. You wrote, just because when you're working for the Lord doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Just when you're out witnessing and you're out trying to, less tithing, mission work, whatever God is having you to do, it's never going to be an easy process. I know my grandparents, when they were in Pakistan and the Philippines, it was easier in the Philippines, but they still faced difficulties after difficulties after difficulties. Sometimes it would feel like they weren't making any progress, but little progress is still progress. And God, what matters to God is the will, the deed, not necessarily the outcomes. Jesus almost walked casually because he would have passed them by. Jesus came over to them only after they responded with fear and cried out. Meaning, Jesus wasn't like, dancing, and he wasn't running across the water. He was just struggling like it meant nothing. And, and seeing him at ease, that it scared the disciples worse than seeing him struggle. If they had been struggling in the water, they wouldn't have been so afraid. They would try to reach over and rescue him. But here he is, just walking with probably his hands behind his back, just looking at the clouds, looking at the fish, looking around, just walking by, and they all got scared. So at that point, Jesus notices, you know what? It's time for me to go and help these people. Augustine would write, he came walking on the waves, and so he puts all the swelling storms of life under his feet. Christians, why are we afraid? If Christ can put all things under our feet, and we walk under his feet, and we walk with the power of Christ, we can do the same. We also know that it was on this occasion that Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water to Jesus. There is reason from history and subtle clues, not explicitly from scriptures, to believe that Peter was the main source of Mark's gospel. If this was the case, Peter may have left out the story because he didn't want to be exalted for walking on the water, or to be humbled for sinking. Mark does not give the incident of Peter's walking on the water and beginning to sink. Perhaps Peter was not fond of telling that story. It's kind of like when we tell stories, sometimes we omit the more grisly details of ourselves, what we did not do as far as that goes. Now moving on to verse 52. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. And when they had passed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and drew to the shore. And when they were come out of the ship, straightway they knew him, and ran through the whole region round about, and began to carry about in beds those that were sick, where they heard he was. And wheresoever he entered into villages or cities or country, they laid their sick in the streets, and besought him that they might touch, if it were but the border of his garment. And as many as touched him were made whole. While this description of the healing ministry of Jesus, with this description of the healing ministry of Jesus, Mark concludes a brief section where we see the power of Jesus over the laws of nature. Normally, 5,000 are not fed by a small lunch. Normally, we don't walk on water. Normally, the sick are not instantly healed. None of this is normal, except by the power of the Almighty God. Thank you. And that concludes today's lesson and Mark chapter 6.